Hello.
Hey.
And well.
Oh, shoot. No, just here. That's right.
Right.
You're right. I can't just say hi right away.
Hello, and welcome to Locutors of Trek,
Supplemental,
the podcast that talks about the people, places, and things of Star Trek. So, grab yourself a canard or a Bolian tonic water and join us far beyond the stars.
Locutors of Trek.
Program initiated. Enter when ready.
Well, hello there. It's me, Davan.
Hi, it's me, Dave.
And this is a supplemental episode of Locutors of Trek.
Indeed. A plain, simple supplemental.
Plain, simple supplemental, you could say.
Indeed.
About the original Tailor, you could say. As many of you may know, we are also the plain, simple Tailors.
You may have seen us around on the intertubes.
On the interwebs.
Indeed. Your infosphere, as it were.
Perhaps even a unimatricy or two.
One or two. So yeah, our topic this time around is Elim Garak. Or should we call him Ten Lubac?
Ten Lubac, perhaps.
Or any number of other things.
Perhaps one Lubac.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you hear any clinging, we do have our canards here with us to celebrate the occasion. But as humans, I must say, Canard is a little easier on the palate on the rocks.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. I think straight Canard
I know a Cardassian would probably frown upon what we're doing here.
Yeah, but this way, we don't burn holes in our digestive tracts, so that's healthy. That's kind of what it feels like otherwise to me.
Yes, me too.
Yeah.
So we're talking about Garak, a favorite character of ours.
Oh,
obviously, he's the spirit animal of our band.
Indeed. And I think it's fair to say he's a fan favorite all around for DS9 lovers.
It certainly seems. It's hard to deny his charm and wit.
Oh, from that first appearance where he meets Bashir and just bamboozles him left and right out to the very last moment we see him. He's just a fascinating on-screen presence.
As the only Cardassian on the station, I thought you, as I do, might enjoy some conversation. It's so good. But as far as the supplemental goes, I thought maybe all cards on the table. We've read the Stitch in Time Garak novel written by the actor who plays him, Andrew J. Robinson.
Yeah. First of a series of 3 novels that include Garak as a protagonist, as far as I know, but the only one written by Robinson.
And from what I've gathered, one of the few novels that Star Trek considers alpha canon.
Interesting. Now that I was going to ask you about. The status of the book is something I hadn't really discovered too much of, but we can understand anything in there essentially as alpha canon.
As I see it as part of, at least, well, it takes place in 3 timelines, just essentially 3 stories going on at once. And I'll kind of see, well, the middle one takes place in essentially season 7 of
season 6 and 7, because we do have reflections on the loss of Jadzia and some other things. But yeah, essentially those last few months, the last year or so of the war.
And you could say third storyline is taking place right after Deep Space Nine, like essentially the next day
in the reconstruction of Cardassia. Yeah.
So I almost see that as like season 8 of Deep Space Nine.
Oh, that would have been an amazing thing to follow. Oh yeah.
And it would have been, and it's captivating. It is.
Yes.
So, spoiler alert. We're going to talk about this novel a lot, so if you haven't read it, keep that in mind. But I will say, just like any great episode of Star Trek, hearing about it doesn't mean you shouldn't watch it and enjoy it.
No, I think we could talk for days about the novel itself and not plumb the depths of its actual fecundity. Now, I have to put all my cards on the table also. I haven't read a novel in probably 15 years. My background is in classics and ancient medieval philosophy up to the present. And so it's generally what I tend to read, that or medical stuff, because I work in healthcare. And I got out of the habit of reading novels for a long time. So this for me was all these moments where Garak is talking about discovering the sort of inner recesses of his psyche and what that's like, I felt like it was opening some stuff up for me again just to read it, because I just hadn't done this with a novel, especially a first-person narrative, in so long. And this one is so beautiful and stitched together so well that, yeah, I found it quite an exhilarating read right off the top.
I can share that sentiment a bit. Actually, I don't read a lot of novels either that aren't in the graphic form. And,
Sure.
Yeah, it had been a while, and this one really draws you in.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking we could tackle the topic of Elim Garak chronologically.
Okay.
And as we mentioned, the 2 and 3 stories in that book, the one in Garak's past is, I guess, where we'll start.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I warn you, dear listener, we'll probably fall back and forth a bit, just because that's the nature of the book, the nature of the story, and as we learn, the nature of Cardassians.
And bring in the appearances on Deep Space Nine as well. Because in this book, it touches on everything. It touches on all the appearances of Garak, every episode. It touches on Cardassian things. I can see why it was adopted as canon, because it's so careful in that regard. So,
it has that meticulousness you expect of Garak as a sort of personality.
Yeah.
So we begin on Cardassia Prime, or what would at one point have been known as Hebisha, maybe, which is an interesting thread in the tale here.
It is.
But we begin on Cardassia Prime, many years before the events of Deep Space Nine. Probably, it's hard to say how old Garak is, but I would guess he's in his 50s when we first meet him. Given his Garak, when on Deep Space Nine, in the series, but not here. He's just ending childhood here. He's just ready.
Whatever's
to go away.
considered middle-aged in that day for a Cardassian, because in the book he actually, near the end, he refers to himself as a middle-aged Cardassian.
Right.
So yeah, it could be 50s.
And we get a very few clues as to when he is in various stages. When he's finishing up his time at school, he's at some point during the Cardassian border wars, but that's a 40-year war, so it's somewhere between 2360 and 2320 or 30 or something like that. So we have a rough dating for when his childhood would be set, probably somewhere in the 2340s or 50s.
So when we first meet Garak, he's, what would you guess?
Oh, 12, probably 12, 13, 14, somewhere like that.
Something like that. And
his ridges have shown.
Yes.
That's what he's able to tell us. And one of the others, I think
it's puberty, I guess.
Is it 9 Lubak, or one of the others whose ridges haven't shown up yet? 7.
Yeah, or at least not very defined.
Exactly, right. And that seems to be a stage of the maturation of the Cardassian into adulthood. Physical
and
adulthood.
there does seem to be a bit of minds bigger in that regard. Kind of like the lobes with Ferengi.
Very much.
And certain appendages on humans.
It's true, yeah. Good old earlobes.
Yeah, lobes on humans. So Garak is living with his mother, Mila, which answers one question we've all had right away.
And his father's name is
Tolan,
that's right.
Who's a gardener.
Yeah.
And I must say I relate to this Tolan character a lot in this book. And,
he's a really interesting
Garak,
character.
when he's embracing that side of himself, you know.
Yeah.
I have a new appreciation of Garak, and I already loved this character.
But yeah, so his father runs some gardens, but also works in gardens in the center of the city that's reserved in many ways for public functions.
Yeah, he's essentially the city gardener and head of maintenance.
Yeah, sort of public works.
They clean up after events and stuff as well. And
his mother is also a functionary. She works in the Hall of Records. So she works in some kind of bureaucratic position, as far as we know, to begin the book.
Perhaps she works in the Hall of Records.
Perhaps she does. Somewhere in that neighborhood.
At least in the same city.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Mila is his mother. The elderly lady we meet in, I guess we see her earlier as well, but it's certainly at the end of Deep Space Nine.
Absolutely.
When they're hiding in her basement. Now, that basement
becomes a focus of the third thread of our novel.
This first thread
Well,
They're
true as
living
well.
in
That's
that
true. They
basement.
live in that basement. That's
So
true.
Mila, Tolan, and Elim live in Enobrin Tane's basement, who Elim calls Uncle Enobrin.
Mhm.
And they live in his basement apartment, and Tolan is his gardener as well,
Mhm.
and Mila his housekeeper.
Uncle Enobrin, who loves to take little Garak on walks around the city.
Yes, little Elim, and these walks are interesting because we've heard how from Ducat and others how Cardassian children are trained in the mind trained from a very young age.
Yeah.
So yes, Uncle Enobrin would walk little Elim through the city and ask him what he's been witnessing,
what he's observed.
Exactly.
That's right.
It's like, Elim, did you see the lady in the green dress, or did you see this, or what happened when we were there, or and as soon as little Elim got one wrong, the walk was over, and they would return home, and Uncle Enobrin wouldn't say a word to him on the walk home.
So very early on, we get to see this picture both of early Cardassian pedagogy, like early childhood pedagogy, education stuff, and parenting. And there's a great deal of switching on and off that we see.
Well, what was
in terms of parental roles?
What was the character
behaviors.
that said to him? Was it Palandine who later says to him, "Poisonous pedagogy"?
Yes.
He's like, how does our society get here, and why are we like this, and why do we listen to these figures who are dishonest or whatever? He says, it's poisonous pedagogy.
Exactly. The kind of way of learning to what in one way Elim later in his life will begin to think of as submit to the shape of the world around them and its givenness. And that sense of the givenness of the world seems to be a deeply Cardassian intuition, that there's no sense in this sense sort of crying over spilt milk or spilt blood from yesterday.
No.
What we need to do is look ahead to where we're going. Time doesn't matter. In the end, even your own importance doesn't matter. It's where you're going that's important.
Which ties into their hyper defensiveness as well. It's like only the present moment and the future really matter. And
yes,
they see threats kind of everywhere. But as you see in the way their society is structured, that makes sense. So essentially, when you reach the age that Garak is at the beginning of this novel, that's when you're assigned to an institute or an academy.
Various kinds of it's a 9-year training program in
3
various
levels.
kinds of fields.
3 levels. Yep. And Garak is told that he will be going to the Bamaran Institute. And there's no warning of this. Just he comes home one day and some stern-looking Cardassian guy is standing there, and Mila's standing there as well. Just like, you've been chosen to go to the Bamaran Institute, Elim. Pack your bags. You're going now, essentially.
Yeah. And during that time, there's no contact with family.
Nope.
So you spend 9 years in beginning isolation. So we can already see sort of the beginning of a sort of a boot camp or an education, a re-education sort of center already, right? There's this sense of alienation from the larger society that's actually supposed to open you up to its principles and how that's going to work. But in what we learn, I think, over the novel, as characteristically Cardassian fashion, learning is the most important learning is done on the job in the midst of the action.
Oh, this is a hands-on education.
That's for sure.
But it's also the beginning of each Cardassian finding their place in this extremely hierarchical society.
Yes. Yes.
How you do in this 9-year program essentially determines the rest of your life, where you can work, what your status will be, your class, that type of thing. And a lot of that's determined by even earlier by the choice of which institute you go to in the first place. But as we see, there is some transfer between the
There is some mobility there, but that's essentially mobility of what they would call opportunity, right? So if someone's noticed you, and those kinds of sub rosa social connections, which we see become deeply important, especially in season 7 of Deep Space Nine, but also everything Ducat is able to get away with over the series. That's how he does it.
Well, we're going to talk about Ducat a little bit later.
Is my sense. It's that web of social connections and the kind of power they exercise over each other in those relationships that allows for this wholly sort of orthogonal politics that's deeply informal but totally regulated by that kind of reptilian socialization that they practice, right?
And these levels are very separated from each other. Your first teacher could be just a student in the level above you in this institute. And as Dave mentioned earlier, 10 Lubach, you're also given a number and placed in a group of 10, usually it would seem. And your number determines basically what your status in society was before you even got there. So being the son of a gardener and a service woman, essentially, he's number 10. He's the last of his group.
In the Lubach group.
In the Lubach group.
And this opens on to...
And they're not allowed to use each other's names. None of them even know each other's names. None of his classmates know his name is Elim Garak.
No.
Garak, Elim, none of it. He's 10 Lubach. And
they're not allowed to fraternize with the female students who are there, except on very, very delimited occasions when they would be in the same place, but still probably not supposed to talk to each other.
Like being called to the gym for an assembly.
Basically, right? So there's this extremely structured life inside which there's a kind of teeming chaos of ambition. And what we begin to see, I think, is that...
And status and trying to live up to parental pressures and all kinds of things.
All of this is absolutely crushing Elim at first. He fails. He's getting beaten up in the pit where they learn sort of martial arts and stratagems. He's getting embarrassed in his classes. He's finding that, by the time they go out on a first sort of stealth orienteering exercise, he's absolutely hopeless at it. And one of his teachers, the line that he says to him, "You need to find your space and hold it," is what Elim realizes he's really struggling with. And here we move into this section of the book where we get this really beautiful sort of psycho-spiritual picture of the Cardassian mind. And I'm just going to come right out and say it. Whatever they understand a spirit to be, he'll often use the word field or energy. But what Elim learns when he's out on his second time out on one of these sort of chase orienteering tests they do.
Yeah, they do field ops where they have compete against other groups and kind of like a manhunt type.
Exactly. Very much. And they're supposed to make it back, but the others are supposed to catch them, and it's shame or glory one way or the other for one side.
But hard, like you're given like maybe enough water, probably not even enough water to really get back to the base. Like it's pretty tough.
And Elim meets and observes the motion. Sorry, just pouring a little Canard there.
Get a bit of Canard on that ice before the ice melts.
Elim notices a group of Ragnars that are moving in the sand, and he notices all of a sudden the way in which, without any distractions, the Ragnar would move completely in unison, waiting for the moment the wind blew the sand. And this opens to him a kind of spiritual revelation or intellectual sort of psychological revelation that allows him, by imitating and following into the spirit of this Ragnar's activities, to learn to
tuning to that energy. Tuning to the energy of the Ragnar.
He learns to harness the field of his own energy and so control his presence in the world. He learns how to disappear, essentially.
Which we see on Deep Space Nine as well. He'll just show up behind somebody or be there the whole time and just poke himself out. Like that was it. He's never lost that ability, and when it doesn't work, it's always unnerving to him.
Absolutely. And this capacity he discovers to control whether he was really noticeable to the attention of others becomes a defining and sort of miraculous technique for him over the course of his time there. He goes from being one of the more sort of lowly and despised among the students because he's essentially failing at everything, to that guy nobody can catch.
Yeah, he broke all records for evasion of capture.
Yeah.
And that really starts to move him forward in this hierarchy. Like, as soon as you can excel at something,
yeah,
the higher ups notice in Cardassian culture.
Now,
and I mean, very much because they find it a threat as well.
And want to put it to use.
Exactly.
And so we learn again more about how Cardassians work and interrelate with each other. There's a sense in which even the gestures of the face, the smile that a friend Elim makes, Palandrine, tells him
Palandine.
about. Palandine, sorry. Yeah.
A female he wasn't supposed to be talking to.
Indeed. Who takes an interest, and they do become friends.
Yeah.
She tells him about smiling when he talks. Elim is very serious, says, what use could that possibly be? And she says, well, the smile disarms people. The smile encourages them.
Yes, it does inform him of it as far as using it as a spy or as just in interpersonal relations. But she also says, don't you see how funny it all is, Garak? And he's just like, and there's nothing funny about Bamaran. This institute is the worst.
He's miserable.
Like, no one's ever nice to you. Like, they give him a mop bucket and they're like, go get some cleaning supplies, and there's people waiting to like beat the crap out of him in the closet.
Yes.
And that they're supposed to be there to do that. And then they're like, no, go. And they're just like but like everything's a test of how do you adapt.
Yes.
Like, they get him and a friend he makes later see the same people that beat him up in the closet coming down the hall later on, and they sneak up on them and beat the crap out of them, you know what I mean? Like,
indeed. And that actually, even though I think it's one of the seeds of a later event, both
we're jumping around.
Both those are, but they it also raises their status and gains them respect, right? So there's all of each of these things are they make a choice, there's a determinate action that has concrete consequences, and consequences they have to keep measuring to figure out what they are. You know, there's the immediate and then there's the future.
Yeah.
And we see that time and time again in how Garak, but also how many of the Cardassians he's describing as he encounters them, are able to work with each other.
Yeah. She's just like, remember, Elim, when they walk away, it's all funny. Remember, it's all funny. But we see that from Garak later. He's often the one laughing or smiling in a situation on Deep Space Nine.
He's always got some sort of a joke.
Yeah, or a
wry line. Yeah,
exactly. He does start to see how it's all funny.
Yes.
But it's right what you said about Garak earlier being a spiritual character as well, because he mentions that, and he's trying to figure out his spirituality through his entire life, from because
he has these experiences, and then he sort of
when he's lost and not lost, well, I'll get maybe lost when he's in the desert trying to
first experience
with the Ragnar and everything. He's a day into being dehydrated at least, and he starts to talk about Mogrind, that a mythical phantasmal creature that returns to correct the moral balance on Cardassia, which is interesting because that comes up way later in the book, the moral balance on Cardassia. And like, children are told he'll visit them if they're bad. He's like their boogeyman too. Like,
I confess, I thought about Ardro when I read about Mogrind there the first time. I wonder if she's ever taken that shape. But we get these pictures of the mythology, but also like the sort of rigorous mundanity of Cardassian life. And they're like they're contiguous. They sit right side by side each other, right? Yeah. And sometimes they conflict, but most of the time they're just there. It's a very living picture of a society.
So speaking of society, every what we're talking about with this institute and these other institutes is basically every segment of Cardassian society has an institute. And like you said, they have 3 levels of education, and if you fail at any of these levels, you're reduced to basically the humble role in society. So there's no really making mistakes in Cardassian society. It doesn't work out for you.
No.
As we see with Gul Dukat, like he makes a mistake and he was leading the whole military and they bump him down to a freighter, You don't really get to mess up. I mean, Caldecott's a bad example of anything because he's horrible, but
but in many ways, he is. I think you could see him as the prototypical production of that era of military civilian hybrid rule between the military and the Tatapa Council. These people who are creatures of just absolute ambition, honed to a very fine edge. And that's really, I wonder what in Ducat's past fomented the sort of complexes we see playing out over DS9. The sort of desire to be adulated by the people he's oppressed, all of that stuff, whether that's just insanely poor coping on the part of a dictator, or whether that's...
We'll do a Ducat episode of
like a deeper malaise that expresses itself through that,
So what I found interesting, while Garak was at the Bavarian Institute, and he starts to get a lot more notoriety, I believe he gets moved up in number, and he's no longer 10. They have eventually have an assessment where there's a new one.
He would have becomes 2 Lubak.
Yeah, 2 Lubak.
Which is a moment of success, but also for him.
He still wasn't rich enough to get one.
Well, he's manipulated and betrayed by his friend Palandine and Charabak,
who was basically his squad leader, essentially.
Yeah, who recruited him to this moment where they were going to change basically the student government of the school. Yeah, through essentially a violent uprising as a sport.
Yeah, as a sport. Yeah, but I found it interesting when he got special permission to go to the archives, because you're not even allowed to go to the library unless you get special permission to study wormhole phenomena. He was super interested in wormholes. Yeah, which is so interesting.
And that's a lovely detail.
Yeah, and so he was there studying the Barzan wormhole and other things. And the reason he found them interesting is, he says, the wormhole tunnel connects the here and now to seeming infinity. And he found that very fascinating.
Yeah. Oh, what a great phrase. Can we just stop for a moment right here and just comment on how poetic good a writer Robinson is?
Yeah, absolutely. This is beautifully poetic.
It really,
it jumps around, but you can still follow it, and it's
absolutely. It's a brilliantly
one of the best novels I've ever read.
Work. Yeah, one of my it reminded me in some ways of another work, by the way that it's a document. It knows it's a document, right, or a series of documents that he's sending to Julian Bashir self-consciously. Yeah, Bram Stoker's Dracula is written in the same way, although they're very different in genre and that sort of thing. Even the number of characters that are writing, Stoker moves through a number of perspectives. It had that feel of sort of the premise is you found a document in the world and you get to explore it, but you can see, and you could really feel the degree to which Robinson inhabited and grew Garak as a character. I remember watching an interview with him at one point where he says, the first time he went in to do Garak, they told him he was going to be a Cardassian, and they showed him what that looked like, and he thought, I'm not going to be able to do this. Because he himself has feelings of claustrophobia in heavy makeup. And I wonder how much of the stuff with the Ragnar, Mila, and that sort of stuff is actually an expansion on those feelings the first time he underwent the makeup to become Garak, right? Because he talks about this fact that he's like, I just closed my eyes and I was like, don't panic. I can always call my agent at the end of the day and say, I am never doing that again. They're going to have to find another Garak. But he says all of a sudden when they said, we're done, he said, I opened my eyes and I looked up and I thought, that's my face. There's Elim Garak right there. And he said, and after that, it was never comfortable. It wasn't that big a problem. Like he kind of wanted to get into Garak again.
To get to Garak,
yeah. And I love that contact.
Great writer. Andrew Robinson. We'll have him on the podcast.
Any day you'd like, Mr. Robinson.
On there, Mr. Robinson. We promise we won't sing a version of Mrs. Robinson titled Mr. Robinson to you.
That's true.
Unless you want us to.
We will make ourselves available independent of time zone or day of week. That we can promise.
Did we mention he named the Ragnar Mila?
The Ragnar that he finds and brings back to his dorm room with him.
Because as much as there's no privacy in Cardassian life, at this institute, you have this one chest, essentially, that no one, not even the higher-ups or the dean of the whole institute, can look in.
Yeah.
So there's this one piece of privacy everyone gets, and he keeps his Regnar in there.
Yeah.
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 And people are like, why is he always just staring in his... He's always like looking at it and stuff, and people are like, why is he always staring in his chest? And eventually they confronted him on it, and that was a big moment for him as well.
Oh, that's wonderful. He uses that ability again to show up in front of them just and sit
they're
up on
talking
his bed.
about him for like 10 minutes, and he's there the whole time, and they never see him.
Yeah, he just allows them to forget that he's still in the room.
Yeah.
And his description of the feeling of that energy is absolutely marvelous. You know, there was an interesting study that was published a few years ago that was about the measurement of brain waves when groups of people are making music. And I think what probably be relatively unsurprising for many people is that when you really sync up and you lock into the groove, or you get into the motion of the symphony or whatever it is, your brain waves will
do it all the time.
Right?
Yeah.
Athletic teams will do it, and he talks about it here, right? Your brain waves will line up. But interestingly, and I would be interested to see if this has been done outside of a musical setting in terms of real research, the brain waves of the group tend to line up on the leader. And we see this playing out in terms of, you know, that like
a wolf pack.
Yeah, or people talking about when Frank Zappa was directing them on stage. And they're like, all he had to do was this. And you would sort of course, they'd rehearse like crazy, just like Elim and his people did.
Fire you.
That's also true. You ever hear Steve Vai talk about his audition for Zappa?
I'm sure it's intense.
He literally looked at him at one point. He's like, now play it in 7.
Yeah.
I think that's how he got to be his transcriptionist first and then got into the band.
Okay, Frank.
Exactly. Thanks, buddy. But, you know, that sense of zoning in together on the intuition of the leader is a feature of real human life as well, but clearly a very powerful feature of Cardassian interrelation. They seem to have that sense about each other in a more palpable way than humans do.
So it's just as he starts to kind of excel at the Bamaran, he's called in for a meeting with the prefect, and Tain is also there.
Who hasn't seen in years at this point.
Hasn't seen in years, hasn't seen his family in years.
Mm-hmm.
And he's told he'll be leaving Bamaran. Mm-hmm. Which he does not want to do, because he wants to complete the task at hand. You know,
yes.
He's like, I've started to, against all odds, succeed here, and I want to
put 3 years of my life into this, right?
Yeah. Like this whole thing, Tain has been watching him the whole time. This is a twisted tale. I don't know if I should spoil it now, but
we don't have time to go through the whole book. That's the trouble.
So obviously, Tain is Garak's father.
She only just barely admits once for 5 seconds before then going back on it.
Yeah. And Mila works with him at the Order. And it turns out they talk a lot. Like, Mila wasn't just the housekeeper. Like, Tain was bouncing everything off of her. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, we're going to start jumping around, because we can't have this podcast last for 3 hours.
They had been conducting a very long-term affair then.
Yes, very much so. And later
in
the book, thing? He turns to Mila, and he's an adult at this point. Mm-hmm. Like, not long before he's sent to Deep Space Nine. Oh, yes, he's there because Tolan's dying.
Right.
And Tolan, she doesn't want him to even be in there. She's like, look, he starts to talk about things that aren't true after a while, and it's important you just leave before he does.
Yeah, she essentially shuts down the relationship of their marriage.
Yeah.
When he takes Elim on that walk to the ruins.
So Tolan tells him, he's just like, I'm not your father. And he's just like, well, who is my father? He's like, that's for Mila to tell you, essentially. And then he dies, Tolan. And
even though he's been a very good father to him.
A very good father, and he's the most like Tolan. Like, yes, he has his Tain, and his Mila and Tain are very much the same. She's not someone who was, you know, at the behest of this tyrant or something. She has all the same ideas Tain does. She sticks up for him. She's just like, you don't understand the sacrifice Tain makes every day for no thanks, and for just because it has to be done, and all these things. She's there because she wants to support Tain in his endeavors. You know?
Absolutely. She has a real clear-sightedness in that determination.
So Elim turns to Mila, and he's just like, Mila, who is Tolan? And she just goes, he's my brother. So in fact, it's Uncle Tolan and Papa Enobrin, not the
all
other
this
way
time.
All this time.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's taken out of Bamaran, and he's brought into the Order, essentially. he's proven valuable enough with his skill of
Mhm.
even camouflage. Turns out, though, in Auburn has the same power and sneaks up on Garak the same way.
Oh yeah.
But,
Oh, that first meeting at the school is wonderful when, after all of this learning about masks and smiles and putting up a certain energy and just morphing as he watches others into these various moments and roles, he meets Anabran, and what he realizes all of a sudden is, I have to drop all of that. I have to speak directly to this man, because we're both at a moment where we're just going to see through all that.
So Bamaran does seem to be essentially like a military / espionage institute. Like you could go either way.
And I can
on
see
how
them
you...
training for military intelligence there, for espionage, for certain kinds of diplomacy, all sorts of stuff, right?
But it's interesting. Do we mention how Garak mentions how Bashir tells them how they're more reptile brain dominated?
Yes.
And so they're always aware of their protected perimeters. Which is what we see in Cardassians. They do seem a little edgy.
Well,
if you get near them, they'll freak out and they'll probably lash out at you.
And it's true. It's as though they're always containing that. It's like watching a monitor lizard.
Yeah, they'll sit there perfectly still. You think nothing's wrong, and all of a sudden, gone.
Yeah, or they're on you.
You got inside their safe perimeter, and now it was fine. Not cool, gone.
Exactly right, and. The sense of that calibration is something that plays a part in Bashir and Garak's relationship the whole time. Is that, and he makes a lovely point to Bashir at one moment, that because Bashir wants him to go to this holosuite program that can help you kind of work through archaic early life material. Because he wants
program.
He's been asked to invite him to this thing by Cisco because he's slowed down on translating the Romulan or the Cardassian codes, basically, and they want him to get back up to speed.
That's the middle story.
That's the middle story
happening right there.
And what he ends up telling Bashir is that every Cardassian you're ever going to meet has processed and integrated everything that's happened to them already.
Yeah, they don't.
Because that's how we live.
Yeah, they don't ruminate.
Yeah, that's the island of our past. Yeah. It may show up in feelings and things, but where we are is the present, and we look at the future.
I really do appreciate that.
It's true, but it lays bare the fact that humans absolutely do not do that.
No.
Like, the way our unconscious works is we carry our past around with us all the time, just like a Cardassian does. It's just
they don't have any
repressed in
questions about it,
right? And it's more limpidly apparent to them. It feels like, as opposed to our techniques of foregrounding consciousness with a certain kind of memorial repression.
And in one of these neat scenes that he kind of sticks into season 6 and 7, which there are a few, like he mentions how he's jealous of Brian and Bashir.
Oh yes, and now they just play darts and reenact World War II.
And he essentially says that their relationship was damaged after the Our Man Bashir episode, where he has to shoot Garak because Garak was going to sacrifice all his friends to save himself, sort of thing.
Yes.
And their relationship never really quite recovered from that, and
he knows that's sort of like the pin that he can drop.
Yeah.
But that it was happening before that, and
and he's mentioning how Odo's noticed this and made an effort to try to spend time with Garak, and even Odo's
put the three of them together.
Yeah, Odo's trying to set up dinner dates between Garak, Odo, and Bashir
as he's pursuing Kiro, which is like that play is fascinating.
This is amazing stuff.
And this is all just what Garak notices in that sense, right?
So he's in the Order now, essentially, and something that wasn't fictional. The Sons of Tain thing is real. There is a kind of cadre of Tain's proteges that they called the Sons of Tain. Mm-hmm. Garak is one of those, and as they mentioned in the show, the Order is broken down into cells, which don't really speak among each other and these types of things. But who else ends up being in the Order with him is, who we learn's name later is Pythas, which is the friend he made in Bamaran, who he snuck up on those guys and jumped them within the hallways. Who was skinnier, but was the most skillful of all of them, even more skillful than Garak.
He was much more balanced.
He was very attracted. You can tell right away, Garak is just attracted to impressive people.
Yes. Yes.
yeah, it doesn't matter if you're male or female or what. If there's something about you that he finds interesting, he's just like with Bashir, or
Absolutely.
with Zial, or anybody. He's just interested in certain qualities. And
yeah, you're right. And anything that's erotic with him sits under that aegis.
yeah,
Like he's gonna, and I think it's true because many of the racial relationships that he talks about, he does experience erotic attraction, as well as any intellectual and moral and professional. And he really kind of, it's like a gestalt attraction when he meets somebody like that. You're right.
yeah. So, and who else is working with him? Right under him in his cell actually is, oh geez, what's her name? Nav or Naj, like Bejar, I believe. Who, there's the Deep Space Nine episode where there's the two female Cardassian scientists who come to the station.
Yes.
And one of them takes a liking to O'Brien, but they have that overseer who's clearly with the Obsidian Order. She worked under Garak.
Oh,
During that, he mentions how during that whole episode, or that whole, goings on Deep Space Nine, she never contacted him and avoided him the whole time. She knew he was there. So
interesting.
So let's jump ahead a little, and so he does quite a few missions with the Order, of course, and one of the more notable ones, of course, is the one on Romulus.
He works as a gardener,
He works as a gardener because of his experience at Tolan. And his gardening skills come right into play with why he's there. So there's a Romulan senator who knows that the Adosian orchids that Garak loves and Tolan loves so much actually become highly, vaporously poisonous if mixed with the seed of this starflower vine. But no one can grow Adosian orchids except for Tolan, essentially, and he taught Garak how to do it. So they need Garak to just grow these orchids because they essentially want to. This eventually all comes back to Tain. It's a Tain plot, and he's working with that Romulan senator to get rid of this other Romulan who, unfortunately, Garak really likes. Garak has to meet this guy and go plant these Adosian orchids on his property, and he's Garak. But what's interesting about Garak is he seems to like Romulans more than Cardassians in a way. He really seems to relate to Romulans and appreciate a lot of things about them. Like, they like open spaces, and so does he. Like, he walks into a Romulan's house and they're like, wow, it's like cavernous in here. Like,
that's interesting.
Like,
yeah. I hadn't really made that connection, but yeah.
But and he appreciates their kind of forthrightness and confidence in what they believe in a way. He's just like every Romulans essentially think of all aliens as like beneath them. He's like, but like they don't hide that. He's like, and I appreciate that. There's like in every sentence they like let you know that they think you're better. They're better than you. Like
that's for sure.
Yeah, but he appreciates that because they're like Cardassians. Everything's so much like cloak and dagger.
Yeah, it's true. You know that the Romulans are coming at the cloak and dagger because they know they're better than you.
Yeah.
Cardassians, you don't know why they're doing it.
So, he goes through with that and he kills that Romulan that he indeed liked. And then he goes back to Tain. And this is one thing I found very interesting, which makes me wonder, did Tain conceive a child with, because Tain makes it clear to Garak that he tried to get Tolan to do this for him. And Tolan would refuse because Tolan is a very peaceful guy, and he was very into this, as we'll probably talk about later, the Habitian philosophy, which were like a proto-Cardassian race, on Cardassia, when Cardassia was lush,
exactly,
in a rainforest,
before its climate changed,
and as the climate changed, they clashed. The Cardassians and the Habitians clashed, and the Cardassians exterminated them, I guess.
Sounds like it, yeah.
Or maybe there was some interbreeding. Who knows? Kind of like a Neanderthal human kind of thing.
Because it does seem that there's a legend that they kind of like evolved out of them in some sense. That's the popular Cardassian narrative. Yeah.
So Tolan wouldn't do this for him, and he wanted to get rid of this Romulan for a long time. And not just that, he wanted to make this Adosian orchid seed thing work. Tain has been aware of this for a long time, and it just seems like the perfect way, because all the evidence of it dissipates by the time you find the body. And they just assumed this Romulan just died from being old.
Right.
But it killed a bunch of other people too, and Garrick's worried that there was children around. There might have been some of them and stuff. So Garrick never really liked what he was doing. He liked the travel.
He was exceptionally good at it.
He was exceptionally good at it.
And that's part of his problem.
Yeah. So, my point is, did Tane conceive a child with Mila just so Tolan would teach that child how to grow Edojan orchids just to make all this thing happen? Because he doesn't really seem to have a use for Elim other than this mission, before or after that. He's exiled essentially after this. Not directly after, but like eventually he's essentially exiled to, because there's another big question we should probably get to. He's exiled because he wouldn't give up his relationship with Palandine. Right. Essentially. Because she's married and he's just having a bit of a dalliance with her anyway. And they're like, Tane's is like, you can never see her again, or like, because it makes us vulnerable. Like, and he's right about their life. He's just like, it makes us vulnerable in all these ways, and he's like, it obviously can't happen. He's like, well, I'm not willing to do that. And Tane's is like, well, that betrays me. So like in the DS9 episode when Tane's dying, he's like, but you betrayed me. And we always like wondered, how did he even betray him? Because he wouldn't give up his relationship with the woman he very much loves.
Absolutely.
He loved her almost immediately.
I think from just about from the moment he meets her. Yeah.
And she's just like, why don't you smile? He's just like, this is a fascinating person.
That's true. He's so
Nobody here smiles. What kind of question is that?
Yeah. But yeah, I absolutely think that. There's so many things about the way that Mila and Tolan live that say that thought was never absent from his mind.
I kept coming back to that. I feel like that's the only reason he conceived a child.
I don't think it's the only reason.
Maybe not. He maybe figured he could use that to his advantage in a lot of ways.
But I'm sure that he also understood that he had natural concerns for legacy. He didn't want to
pass it over to Elim, but obviously that didn't happen. And it goes to Pythos, his friend.
So there's these. I think he could have seen a whole variety of functional reasons to have a child with this woman who was absolutely devoted to him, and who would never ask him to actually marry her, or any of that stuff. Wouldn't make any kind of impediment on his life at all. And would actually actively support him in all this. And he could essentially offload the parenting duties to Mila and Tolan. Absolutely. I don't think it's the only reason, but I'm sure it is one of the important reasons that he might have done it, for sure.
And as far as his claustrophobia goes, there's obviously Tane used to lock him in a closet. On a mission in Zenket, he's buried alive.
For what sounds like weeks. Yeah. Or many days before he's rescued. He's weeks recovering. Yeah. Physically, at least. And that's with 24th century medical technology.
Which is interesting because wherever he's ever assigned to live, even in his childhood home, it's always a basement. Like wherever he's assigned to live after that, it's always a basement, and then he's off to Deep Space Nine, which is
the basement of space.
Yeah, the space basement.
In his view,
the spacement.
Watch him actually live on the levels that are below like the halfway line.
But it's so interesting that like where they're all hiding out in the last couple episodes of Deep Space Nine, it's his childhood home. It's Mila's basement. That's where Tane's basement. That's where he's back there. And
it's a remarkable full circle.
But she's just like, you guys could clean up in here. This place hasn't been cleaned in years. And like when they're going through all that stuff, that would be
that's his
the things he remembers, and he never really lets that slip.
No.
But wow.
But that's incredible, right? He never even lets it slip that Mila's his mother.
No.
Neither does she.
And he mentions that one day when Tane is dying, And they talk about that day, whereas it's one of those walks they went on.
Yeah.
And he takes him to where that beast is that he rode or whatever. And it was on one of those walks.
Yeah. It was just one of their great days.
It was just the one day where it's just like he made it through all of the questioning. He's just like, okay, let's go ride or whatever that is,
Yeah.
He never gave up then. It's like the one day.
Yeah.
where like Entane talked to him proudly all the way home and that sort of thing. Like,
Yeah,
was
yeah.
silence on the way home like it was every other time. That was the one day that they're talking about.
Yeah.
So like, oh yeah, I was talking about the claustrophobia. They make it very clear, or he makes it very clear in this book, Garak loves Cardassia. Like, he may like Romulans better than Cardassians in a way, but he loves the things.
Oh,
about
absolutely.
Cardassia.
Yeah. He has a very deep love for his home.
Yeah, so when he's freaking out in the episode after Image, because he feels like he's betraying the Cardassian people, and it's causing this claustrophobic reaction, that all makes a lot of sense. The claustrophobia and the regret of betraying his people, it all makes so much sense.
And in a weird way, it kind of gives the lie, but also affirms what he said about the Cardassian relationship to their past. Because this is obviously material from his past, which is coming out. Now, it may be that he was able to integrate it relative to that past. But when it comes up into the present, there are various moments in the novel where stuff comes up into the present for Elim that he just doesn't know what to do with it in that moment. He's just like, okay, I'm observing, I'm clocking this, but I'm going to have to wait to see how it plays out, just like everybody else is, because I don't know what that force is. And that piece of Cardassian psychology, as opposed to like the introspective or even the sort of psychoanalytic depths of human psychology, to me, I found really fascinating. And he bodies it forth really well on the page.
One thing we didn't mention was back at Bamaran, well, we mentioned the pit quickly.
Yeah.
But it was a huge part of it. The competition, the physical competition, and being able to better your, your peers was a huge thing. And it was very much that same kind of sentiment with those desert kind of manhunts that they do. It's all about being able to better the other.
Absolutely. And he remarks upon that playing soccer later, that Cardassians don't do sports like humans. Their idea of sports is like limiting the opponent's ability to compete severely.
He's like, it's human sports. He's like, I understand boxing. He's just like, but basketball is just endless monotony. Why would anyone do it?
They're just bouncing stuff.
Yeah, he's just like bounce, shoot, bounce. He's like, what?
Yeah, like nobody even hits anybody or knocks them down.
The point I was going to make, though, was the episode Empok Nor. The whole time he's just like, I would love to compete with the hero of Setlec 3. I would love to compete with a man like you. That's going back to the pit,
Yes.
where he's recognized a person. He's just like, oh, imagine if Chief was in the pit. Like that would be I would. I'd like to fight Chief in the pit.
Yeah.
Or in one of those desert competitions. Because Chief's an impressive guy. Everyone.
Absolutely.
He can do anything, man. He can be the best soldier, the best engineer, the best anything.
When he's just got so many years of experience
he can be
doing this
fun
stuff,
guy.
right?
Like, he can do. Chief is awesome.
The man for all seasons.
Yeah, man.
Just wait for our O'Brien supplemental.
Oh, God.
Parts 1, 2, and 12.
It may seem like I'm in love with Miles O'Brien in that episode, but we'll determine by the end of it whether that's true.
Or whether he's just really in love with Miles O'Brien.
Yeah, or maybe I'm just really in love with Miles O'Brien and want to be Miles O'Brien. But anyway. So I guess we should talk about the exile. We found out that it was due to his relationship with Palandine. So he's assigned, he's still part of the order, but he's assigned to a different cell, and he's no longer the head of it. He was the leader of his cell. And now he's like probably at the bottom. And he has to report to it. He constantly runs into people he knew at Bamaran because they were all in the same institute for the same type of work.
Sure.
So it all makes sense.
Yeah.
Like his buddy ends up running the order after Tane when Garrett's exiled, and another fellow that he kind of liked. There was like 2 or 3 people in his 10 that he kind of liked, and the rest of them he really didn't like because they were kind of like a bit upper class and entitled and not particularly moral.
Yeah, he discovers they're just basically untrustworthy.
Yeah,
they'd turn on him in a moment. Yeah, yeah.
And some of them he ended up like discovering their plots and stuff and being involved in some. But there's that one guy who's like the least smart of all the people in the thing, and he's just like,
but he is just massively strong.
And his cousin's just like, no. He's just like, why is he involved, Garrett? Because they're like doing this plot thing, and he's just like, no, you understand? My cousin is the perfect person to deliver a message. He can't do many things, but he's the perfect person to deliver a message.
That's all he's good
This
for.
book is so good. Like,
Oh, man.
I don't care what we say about it. Everyone who listens to this podcast has to go read this book. It's so good.
Yeah.
So he gets to Deep Space Nine, and it's during the occupation. And not too long before the changeover from Cardassian to Federation Bajor control
Okay.
of the station. I gather, I wouldn't say longer than a year.
Okay.
I don't think it was too long. But he's sent there to mend garments of the Cardassian soldiers there. Because they had a Cardassian tailor there who, I don't know, they executed him for something. So, like, all the Cardassians are getting tattered clothes, so they're like, they need a tailor. And he doesn't know how to be a tailor, but that's his job. So they send him there, and they're like, here's your tailor shop, and they just, like, there's your pile of uniforms to fix. He's just like,
Okay, then.
okay. So, like, there's days go by, and he hasn't fixed a single uniform. And there's Ducat's running the station, of course. Oh, hey, Dave, do you think Scrain is the best Star Trek villain of all Star Trek villains?
Scrain.
Scrain.
I don't know. I like the Borg.
We come to find out that Gul Dukat's first name is Scrain.
Terrible name.
But it
isn't
fits him so well.
Oh, it
doesn't
really
it?
does.
Doesn't it?
Oh, it's such an awful name.
Scrain Ducat.
Oh, man.
Yeah, and there's a twisted history. Well, there's probably one other Obsidian or mission of Garak's we probably should have mentioned, which is the one, because we've seen on Deep Space Nine how Ducat blames Garak for the death of his own father.
Mm-hmm.
Pre-Cal Ducat.
Mm-hmm.
And Garak definitely kidnapped him, drugged him, and interrogated him, and that ended up in his death.
That's true.
But what that interrogation makes you realize is there are elements of Cardassia that want to be more Federation-like. And Pre-Cal Ducat was the biggest opposition to that. Highly prejudiced against everything not Cardassian, especially Federation and Klingons. He thinks that the Federation, philosophy and ideals is a disease.
Wow.
And as soon as you sense it in somebody, that person is diseased, and they're you need to get rid of them, even if they're Cardassian. He was a hardliner for Cal Ducat.
Mm-hmm.
And he tells all this to Garak under, drugs and interrogation.
Sure.
Garak is clever. He's losing this interrogation. It's not going out so well. So he pretends to be Scrain Ducat. Gul Ducat.
Right.
And he does it. He even says when he first meets Scrain Ducat, he just is just smiling at him, but smiling through him,
Yeah.
I mean? Just this superior smile. But he's he had the longest neck of any Cardassian I've ever seen, which is true, right? He's a crazy long neck.
That is why Cardassians
Yes, I know.
Marco is
But
the
none of them else-
physiological prototype of Cardassians.
He ends up being the only one with a long neck. It's too bad you couldn't find 100 long-necked actors.
It's true.
I'd
honestly watch Ducat be the paragon of Cardassian male beauty. Right?
So the way he tricks Pre-Cal Ducat is he kind of tries to extend his neck out as much as he can and look like Scrain, and it fools him. And he's just like,
That's
"Boy,
awesome.
we have to, get rid of these." So that was his other really big mission with.
That puts so much of the lie to everything, more of the lie to everything Ducat later says about, the loving Bajor and all that stuff. It's just so twisted.
That really informs the Scrain Ducat character.
Yeah.
Highly, highly xenophobic, which we see, the way he thinks of Bajorans and things, and it's all there. His father was just
so sort
him.
of paternalistic toward everything.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But even the illusions of being this supreme leader of everything, his father was higher up than even he was. Pre-Cal Ducat was huge. So yeah, there's gonna be a Ducat episode eventually.
Yeah. So yeah, it's very much the way that Calix would have taught him to, or advised him to hold his space, because he's faced with all of these angry Bajorans sort of staring him down when he wakes up, basically.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. He's
And
attacked.
He's got to find some way of holding on that doesn't depend on their goodwill.
It's
because he can't.
It's like a space within a space. It's
Yeah.
he's holding his shop within a station, which is truly the only thing he only refuge he has.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. But you're right. As you say, he does eventually make himself essentially indispensable in the station, whether it's through his design work or
Yeah.
eventually other reasons that he becomes useful to particularly Captain Sisko.
And one place where this book really touches on an episode is The Wire, where we get to see exactly when and why it was implanted. And and Garak's all for it. The doctor who implanted it in him is somebody Garak actually respected and looked up to. And he explained it to him perfectly, but he told Garak, he's like, this will work great, as long as you don't tamper with it. Which
Garak absolutely does.
Which we think in the episode of The Wire, maybe it was a recent type thing. I guess maybe he says when it is. But pretty much as soon as he got to Deep Space Nine, he turns that on and leaves it on. He didn't wait any time at all. He knew he was in a place he didn't like.
Yeah.
Claustrophobic, perhaps. And so it had been running basically as soon as he got there.
For better part of a decade. I would guess, by the time he gets it shut off. Oh, no. Better part of 4 or 5 years, I suppose, by the time he gets it shut off. That's right.
Yep. So that's another place they touched on that.
But he also, there's this thread in what's going on that which I think is true both of the Cardassian literature we hear him talk about with Julian Bashir at many points, but also just true of his experience of others, that there's this constant unease and constant search for solid stepping stones on which to move forward. And he's constantly looking for that in every relationship.
And what's interesting is when the wire's being implanted in him, he's like, so it'll kick in at a point. He's like, once you reach a certain threshold of pain, he's like, because we can't take away all your pain. That would be monstrous, is what he says to Garak. And of course, Garak ends up taking away all of his pain.
Yeah.
Becoming a monster upon himself,
Yeah.
But, geez.
It's an interesting way of pointing to a kind of addiction that's very science fiction in that it's a cyberware addiction.
Yeah.
But still works along the lines in which many kinds of descents into substance or like practice, gambling, that sort of stuff, abuse, occurs as a form of coping, as a form of papering over a bad reality, and that's not in the sense, talking about his sort of moral weakness, even though Garak does kind of flirt with that notion. It's more about knowing where you are and having some kind of adaptation to it that just stops working if it ever did work very well.
Yeah. It's interesting, when kind of rewinding a bit here, but when Garak was, it's, again, speaks to, I guess, the relationship between Dukat and Garak, but when Garak was interrogating Pre-Cal Dukat, he realized that he needed to convince Pre-Cal Dukat that it was a dream, because as a hardcore military man, a dream state is more fearful to him than an interrogation, which he's been trained probably ad nauseum to resist and that type of thing. So he pretends it's all a dream. It's very clever, very, very clever. So Garak quotes James Joyce during his exile, and he realizes he gets sent to DS9, and it occurred to him somebody during his previous life convinced him to read James Joyce, who he felt was kind of elementary.
Well, I think it's like Ulysses that he reads, isn't it, or something? I forget what book he reads.
No, it's the one with the quote. What is it? It's like the portrait of an artist or something.
Oh, right. Sure.
And it's the quote is silence, exile, cunning, and he sort of makes that his mantra going forward on Deep Space Nine.
That's right.
So, I guess that kind of catches us up to the end of the Deep Space Nine show. It's kind of fast forward here a little. So Garak's there on Cardassia.
And this is the place of his...
Damar is dead.
This is the place of his writing. This is where he's writing to Julian from, where he's trying to collect all these sort of leaves scattered in the wind and pull them together into some kind of coherent whole.
At first, he's just in Tolan's tool shed, essentially.
Yeah.
And he just leaves the door open because it makes the space seem bigger.
Yes.
But he talks about how the unsettling dust. He's like, the dust, so much dust was just kicked up like months later, weeks later. It just will not settle. Wherever you go, you're just choking on dust.
And I love that. I mean, he talks about the constituents of the dust, right? There's ground up food stuff in here. There's buildings. There's the ashes of who knows what. There's so much in this dust that he talks about it forming a kind of paste in his mouth and on his food, and it's an extraordinary image.
Yeah, everything tastes like that dust. He's like, food is not enjoyable. It just tastes like this dust.
Yeah. And that to him is what has remained. That's what Cardassia is when he lands there at first, is just that dust.
Yep. And he eventually works his way into the basement apartment he grew up in, and he finds Mila's body there. No one bothered. No. So what's interesting is Garak is now working very closely with Dr. Parmack.
Pulling bodies out of rubble and trying to pull live people out of the wreckage as well.
Bodies and people potentially you can save. Dr. Parmack, if you remember, on Deep Space Nine, was the fellow that Garak stared at for 4 hours to break him under interrogation. And
all he could say in the end was just his eyes.
His eyes. And he says, as much as Parmack says he's forgiven him, he still doesn't like to look Garak in the eyes.
Yeah. But again, that whole interrogation takes on the character of that energy work.
And it turns out
the smile,
And it do you know the reason for Dr. Parmack's interrogation?
Oh, I've forgotten that now.
Because he was Tane's doctor. So Tane thought he was in the perfect position to assassinate him if he wanted to. So he was just grilling him to see if anyone hired him to assassinate him.
Tane is such a monster.
He is a monster.
That's one of the other takeaways from this book, that as bad as we thought an Tane was,
and as much as Mila may try to justify his actions, Tane's actions,
but he's absolutely just.
He is a monster.
He's worse than Sloane in some respects.
Oh,
not in others.
He's worse than Sloane. Yeah, I would say.
But he's pretty awful. Yeah, I don't know. I think Sloane tried to have an actual family, didn't he? He tried to be like
he did in his head. I don't know if that was real.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows? But certainly he wasn't imagining a being a father in the way an Tane didn't.
No. So what we have left on Cardassia, and so Garak eventually he moves into that basement apartment. He gets Mila's body out of there and eventually finds a way to move in. Like, it's all rubble, but he finds a way that, like, he says Tane's main floor was so strong that it held up the rubble from the basement.
And he builds a bunch of shrines there for a while before he ever goes in, which is really interesting.
He doesn't know why he's doing it. He just starts picking up rubble of Tane's house and making monuments out of it, which catches people's attention.
And they come and begin reciting litanies of the dead.
It becomes very much like a town center for.
But again, the spiritual aspect of Elim comes out.
Yeah, it does.
And
politically on Cardassia, there are really two main factions. There's the Reunion Project, which is led by the nephew, I believe, of Tekeni Gamor, who you know from DS9 as the person who thought, the Cardassian who thought Kira was his daughter. I believe it's his nephew, Alon Gamor, who Garak also went to Bamaran with. But he respected him. So it was basically, those are the three on one side. It's Dr. Parmack, Gamor, and Garak sort of representing this push towards democracy and voting, because there's nothing. They need to assemble some sort of new system in government on Cardassia. And the other main faction is the Directorate. And this is a group who strongly believes that the enemy is still out there, whether it's the Federation or the Klingons or whatever. The reason the Cardassians were the way they were and so conquering and outward pushing with their empire is because they're the enemies out there. It's that xenophobia of that reptile brain, that safe.
Well, in a funny way, it reminds me too of that early TNG episode with Worf and the other Klingons, where they end up in engineering, and Worf
one dies.
He makes the point to the living Klingon that you've got this all wrong. You're taking the coward's way out, just trying to take a ship and set the galaxy on fire. The true warrior makes battle with the forces within.
Yeah, exactly.
And I feel like they're representing, in a certain sense, those two sides in Cardassia as well, in a Cardassian way.
And we skipped over, I'll get back to the director in a second, but we skipped over the fact that Garak started with Paladine showing up to these Habitian sort of meetings where they would act out old Habitian beliefs and imagery, and Paladine got very involved in that, as did her daughter Kel. I guess we skipped over the fact that Garak had basically an affair with Paladine and then killed her husband. So
that's Garak for you.
But he was not a nice guy.
That's also true.
And
there was a bit of a long-standing grudge.
And he severely beat Paladine. Like, he had it coming. He definitely had it coming. So what's interesting about this directorate group, though, is it had the most amazing cast of characters. Madred is the one who invites Garak to the meeting. But the meeting also has Legate Parn, who's basically seems to be the kind of overseer of the whole thing. It has Gully Vec. It has Naj Dejar, who Garak worked for. It has Pythos, his buddy who was running he was there.
It makes sense for him to be there in many ways.
Like, all of these Cardassians that we've seen before, they're all here at this round table, and they just want Cardassia to be what it was, you know? And eventually they're just like, Garak, are you with us or what? And he's just like, you know what? I don't think I am. I appreciate the invite, but I don't think I should be here at this meeting. So he, kind of officially joins the reunion project, and there's this kind of solidifying moment where Garak's asleep and he just hears this rubble crashing and this type of stuff. And he goes outside and he realizes some of the members of, lackeys, not those people around that round table, but some of the lackeys of the directorate are there destroying the monuments of Garak's. But he sort of knew this type of thing was possible, and so did Parmac and the other. So he had an alarm set up for this purpose. So as soon as he heard that, he sounds the alarm, and all of a sudden these, handful of Vandals are surrounded by dozens of Cardassian just citizens, and they're not being violent. They're just all staring at them. And the Vandals don't know what to do. They're expecting a fight, but no one's fighting them. So eventually one of them freaks out and punches this one guy, and expecting it to set off a brawl, which is what he wants because it'll distract from his own action. But nothing happens. Everyone's just silent and stares at him. And so he just runs off. And then they're left with the rest of them. And the leader of them, who was probably just some sort of military guy, probably served under Ebek or something like that.
All those ties of loyalty that we learn about, right?
Yeah. And he's just like, this is shit, he says. He's like, what am I supposed to do? Start fighting these women or whatever, he says? Am I just supposed to fight these citizens, essentially? And he leaves, and they all leave, and then that gets back to the directorate, realize that they had been defeated with peace, because they had decided in the reunion project they weren't going to respond with violence. So then they get an offer, and Parmac's like, Garak, you have to come to this meeting with us with the directorate. They want to talk, which probably means, they want to make some sort of deal, try to work it out. And Garak's just like, no, that's, for one thing, I can't go because I just walked out of their meeting. That'll be disruptive. But they're going to try and kill you. No. Well, no. He's like, you understand these people want this vision of Cardassia more than anything. They're going to offer you prominent positions in their way of doing things. Yeah. He's like, that's what they're going to offer you. He's like, they don't have interest in what we want. And he's like, and if you were to accept their deals, you would be betraying what you want for Cardassia. He's like, but go listen to them, see how desperate they are, and he's like, see if you can make contact with Pythos, because Pythos wouldn't speak to Garak at the meeting. He's just like, just tell him I want to talk to him, if you can. Yeah. So that all happens, and Parmac and Gamor weren't having what the directorate were selling. But many of them were taken with Gamor, and Parmac especially were the things he spoke of, because Garak told him before the meeting, he's just like, I've learned things about you doctors, which he learned from Bashir, of course. He's just like, you don't look at things like politicians do. He's like, so go there and treat Cardassia as a patient that needs to be healed. Don't speak to these other people as other politicians you need to make a deal with. Just speak to them. And he did, and I guess he won a lot of them over. They were, Avec was impressed, and some of these other ones. Because, people like Avec were left just confused. The system they so believed in just so betrayed them.
Absolutely. Without a firm foundation, they look to build a new one, right? Yeah.
So the director eventually agrees to not an election, but a voting competition.
I love that accommodation.
We will not have an election. We will compete with votes. So
it's called the vote pit.
This has nothing to do with Federation democracy. This Cardassians fighting.
Root beer fizz for us, thank you.
We're in the pit fighting over votes. So that's what they agreed to.
Yeah.
And there were 6 districts, and the reunion overwhelmingly wins 4. Basically, that's the end of the book. But essentially, it wraps up with Garak saying, if it was a Federation ploy to stop Cardassian, overreaches into the galaxy, he's like, it worked like a charm, because all we do now is argue over where this road goes or where this treatment plant goes. He's just like, we don't have time.
We're too busy getting on with life.
Yeah, exactly. So he's like, if it worked, it worked. And, that's Elim Garak. He's now, trying to heal his...
Yeah.
And those people are the reunion people are somewhat taken in by, the Habitian kind of...
I mean, I think he's experiencing his own healing as well.
Yes.
After a long life of injury, privation, loneliness, and rejection, he's finding a life on Cardassia that I don't think he could possibly have imagined before he landed back there, and that is something that is truly novel for Elim Garak.
Truly, there is nothing simple about being a tailor.
No, very little plain either. End transmission.